What's going on YouTube? I'm Nick the Tutor, and today we're going to talk about the SAT, but we're going to talk about whether or not it's going to die. People have been asking me for the past year, is the SAT on the way out? Will it eventually die? In this video, I'm going to give you my answer as to whether or not the SAT will die in the near future or not. I'm going to go through the history of the damage done to the SAT and to tell you exactly why it might live or it might die. So let's get into it. Alright, so let's talk about the history of the damage done to the SAT. The first thing I want to talk about is the test optional movement. That started decades ago and basically was where a school said, we don't need your SAT score. Now, many more schools are now adhering to test optional policies, and that has increased exponentially because of COVID. But that was the first huge blow to the SAT. Fast forward several decades, there was another huge blow to the SAT, and that was when the University of California system went test blind. So basically they are not even looking at your SAT scores. And they actually have a 5-year plan to fully phase it out and phase in their own test. Beyond that, because of huge scandals, people feel that the SAT is unfair. They feel that it's riddled with cheating, and it's just not made for today's student. Combine all those factors together and you have an environment for SAT death, where the SAT is no longer wanted or needed by any school in the United States. Now the question is, will we reach that point? Will we ever reach the point where all schools, or a majority of schools, are basically saying, we don't want to see this score, we don't see any value in it? In order to answer that question, we're gonna have to look at what will be replacing the SAT. Now, you probably have heard a lot about college essays being, one of the most important parts of the college process, and that is definitely true. To replace the SAT, colleges have looked more towards GPA, extracurricular activities, and essays. But there's a problem. Part of the reason that the SAT is shunned is that it's deemed to be unfair for low-income students and first-generation college students. But the problem is college essays and essay writing has deemed to be equally unfair, if not more unfair, to those groups of people. Some people argue that removing test scores actually just masks a bigger problem. The test scores are a result of a poor education system in many communities. The reason that the students don't have high scores is because of the education system, not because of the students. So basically what we're doing is we're eliminating the SAT and replacing it with something that may be even more unfair, which is definitely not the intended result of the test optional movement. So what does that mean? I'll tell you, the test optional movement is definitely here to stay. Students that do not want to submit test scores will not have to and will be able to apply to schools that just won't care about the SAT. But I think a lot of schools, a lot of top-ranked schools are going to realize that there's a big problem with removing the SAT as a requirement, because it's just not going to achieve the intended result of diversifying the class of students attending the school. Because of this, schools will find new ways to diversify their class. They'll do other things to find diverse applicants and bring them into the school. That means the SAT will probably reemerge several years from now and become more prominent than it may be today. The other possibility, which is kind of a disaster scenario for students, is that schools may start coming out with their own tests. The big criticism that's legitimate about the SAT is that it's just not a test that's really applicable to what students learn in school, and it's also not relatable to today's student. It's too antiquated. So a new test is definitely a possibility. One of the reasons that the SAT was implemented many years ago was to eliminate a multi-test system where each school had their own tests. So for whatever reason, we seem to be moving backwards. One last thing to consider is that the test optional movement greatly benefits the colleges in that they get more applications and can have a lower acceptance rate. At the end of the day, I think there's several possibilities. Number one, a new test emerges. Number two, schools start developing their own tests. Or number three, which may be unlikely, the SAT dies in its entirety. What do you think is going to happen? Let me know down below if you think the SAT is dead or do you think it's going to come back. I'd love to hear from you guys. Peace.